was indeed written, again, as a travel report. And this is basically where this description of the North Pole was derived. There was a summary written from it a couple of years later. And unfortunately, in the 16th century, both books were already lost. Nevertheless, it was Gerhard Mercator who wrote to an English colleague of his a letter in 1577, dated 20th of April 1577, and there he indeed accurately described the setup of the North Pole as it is depicted in this map. This map he has already drawn a bit earlier, so it was indeed originating from 1569, but hey, in these times, indeed, a year still was a year. By the way, the books are lost, but the letter that Gerhard Mercator wrote to his colleague in England can be viewed today in the British Museum, so it is there. Compared to the first map we've looked at, this is of course a rather dull thing. No dragons. I don't think there are any, no, there aren't any sailing ships on it, so therefore it was of course so that the expression and the way that these things were presented, they were changing. They were, of course, under fashion. There were certain trends in visual design back then. And nevertheless, it was so that all these maps by all the auctoritates, as they were called, people who really knew their stuff, Mercator, yes, whatever he drew, just got sold like sliced bread, no doubt about that. Ortelius, yes, it worked out. And it was Mercator who indeed in 1595 published the first, well, big map book, sorry, don't want to be sued. The first big map book which carried the name of Atlas. And in case you would have any such map book at home, chances are very good that it still is labeled Atlas to the present day. Just for getting this sorted, this frame indeed marks the very same part as I showed you in the very first slide. And it indeed resembles, or it indeed consists of the thing which has this thing up there with Pygmae hic habitant. So basically, yes, Ortelius just took this and just put it, well, he didn't depict all of it really, so he just put it down there. But other than that, the shapes, the cities, the locations, the coastlines, everything in the very same shape. So this is what I mean by data copy pasting, and I don't mean it any bad, so I don't mean to blame anybody for it. Why reinvent something that already is there and that obviously does work? Yet the question, Pygmae hic habitant, I mean, has anybody been there? Has anybody seen them? So again, what is it? Is it data that we're looking at? Is this data, is this an accurate depiction of the world as we know it? Well, we may have our opinion, and they truly had theirs, but just to get you an idea what this is all about. I have yet another example for you, and unfortunately we have to stick with map making. I'm very sorry for that. And I'm not quite sure whether this is to be seen at all, but there are close-ups, so don't worry. This is indeed a map which has one particular purpose. Well, in fact, it has two particular purposes, as we shall see upon the course of our exploration. What I did, after all, I'm dealing with data here, so I applied a very simple measurement as I figured out, oh, there are scales on the edges of the map, so, okay. Let's see what we can derive from the data there. First of all, we have the title, BC 32348, isn't it? The Deluge. I had to look it up. I don't know whether you would, but a flood, basically the flood. Indeed, I think in Finnish it would be, I think I've written it down. In Finnish it would mean tulva, if I'm not totally wrong. A big flood, right? Okay, so we have the title here. We have then some measurements derived from here. So this is pretty much the data that can be derived from this particular map. So we have a latitude, we have a longitude, and we have a title. And if I now take the latitude and longitude data and put it into a modern tool, then pretty much this is where I end up. Now, yes, latitude and longitude of a point, so pretty much it was here. Okay, well, here, so, sorry. And yes, you may already have known that because you've recognized the map, or you've been there, or you've planned your next travel destination. For all those who didn't recognize, this is a close-up of it. So we see a couple of things here that may or may not resemble something known. The river Euphrates is there. There is yet another river called Hiddekel, We see the Mount Ararat there, and we see the name of the region, Eden. Never heard of it, really. What else we see on top of it are clouds. I mean, look at it. It really looks like an eye of a storm to me, or how it goes. Well, then if you would take that book that I just showed you the screenshots from, if you would take that in your hand and would just go on and going a couple pages further in that book, then you would see this. And the title for this particular map is The World After the Third Punic War in 146 before Christ. So what we see is the clouds have withdrawn further. Indeed, the whole thing seems kind of to glow from the inside. So it's like, it's more than just depicting data. It's indeed telling a story. It's telling a story of the darkness will vanish and knowledge will emerge. And this is, of course, well, a rather romantic way of putting it. But indeed, if you look at the title screen or the title page of that particular book, well, I think it's a bit too tough to read. So therefore, the relevant parts are a series of maps as the world, of the world as known at different periods. Well, that makes a perfect purpose for a map, doesn't it? So therefore, we go for it. It is depicting the political changes of each period. How I guess these were the colors that were put there. And it is accompanied by a narrative of the leading events exhibited in the maps. So basically this thing has at least two purposes. Depicting the world as it was known at certain stages, and of course creating a narrative about it and a narrative around it. And indeed, I mean, I've read a couple of them through, so I would have loved to have such a map if I was, or such an atlas if I would have been in school. And it indeed, all the way the whole thing is presented, it indeed is far beyond just display of data. It's far beyond the question or the answer of, is it accurate? Indeed, what we see here is more or less an early anticipation of what we can tell is the panorama. The panorama, from Greek, pan and orama, yes, all and view. And it is no real wonder that the panorama has been the first mass medium from the 19th century. Indeed, it is so. Just what this book exposes, the view on the world from an elevated perspective, exactly this is what the panoramas did for basically the middle classes. Panoramas were situated physically in domes or cupolas, and then people would have to climb steep ladders up to just then have a look and could really indeed look around them 360 degrees and they wouldn't see a break in the picture. So this was indeed the first mass media experience that was, well, of course people had to pay entrance fees for it, but it is indeed more or less the spirit of the time back then. This atlas, this historic world atlas of the world, I have shown you, is originating from 1830. It comes from, according to Hans Rosling back then, it must have been the most prosperous country in the world in 1800. Yes, England. It's an English book. And the first panoramic settings were as well erected in England. They came to Germany pretty shortly after that. And while the first cupolas, while the first domes had a diameter of about 10 meters, so basically we would have been able to fit one in here. But as soon as people were moving around it, basically the perspective was shifting so heavily that they got indeed sick. They indeed got this simulated sickness from it. So therefore then in later stages they have then enhanced the diameter of the panorama from 10 to 30 meters, so that was a bit more comfortable. And of course, as you may imagine, they were only plastered with paintings. And of course it could be just any painting. So you could enter a panorama in, let's say, London, and could all of a sudden see how the world looked in a totally different place. Anyway, data, depicting things, showing things as they are. This is truly not all there is out there. So I'm wrapping up. I think I owe you at least a couple of bullet points that you can take away with you. When it comes to data, according to my experience and hopefully according to the narrative I just presented here, conventions seem to matter more than objectivity. The old OT map that we looked at a bit earlier had indeed basically east on the top of it. Our today's maps have north on top of the maps. And of course, the label east was depicted as Orient in the map, in the old map. Orientation, our word from today, pretty much comes from there. Conventions matter more than objectivity. Data and context, and this is now, you may or may not agree with me, data and context are codependent. It is indeed so that data is fueling a narrative. And it is indeed so that basically a narrative or a context is needed to bring data alive. After all, hey, data, 182 centimeters. Yeah, so what? So basically everything else, everything that we do with it is basically outside of the data itself. I would indeed put it like this: context indeed always requires an external reference. And if you take one and the same data source and decide to make a comparison in time, then you are using time as an external reference. You are taking data from one source, yes, but you are adding yet another dimension to it. You are adding a context to it which is not residing in the data. Would anybody prohibit you from comparing data you've assembled for 1 week and comparing this with data you have assembled for a month? No, of course not. Because it's you, it's the context that is created by the spectator, which isn't inherent in the data. Statements about measurements require disclaimers. I think this is fair to say. And if we are measuring, shall I do it? If we are measuring with web analytics tools, I did it. If we're measuring visits, if we're measuring visitors, we all know there are certain flaws to it. There are certain blind spots to it that we really can't see. And I think it was Douglas Adams who came about the idea that basically, yes, a piece of hardware, a wristwatch, is working absolutely perfect if the day's length is about 24 hours. If you're on a different planet and find yourself on one with 38 hours, basically you're lost. There's no accuracy in your data. So therefore, we'd better put disclaimers to our statements about measurement. Now this is the toughest part. Success criteria, based on all I've said today here, may just be yet another narrative. I think I couldn't throw a stone without, or no, let's put it the other way around. I think most of you would agree that it is absolutely perfectly fine to focus on business outputs, business outcomes. So basically, okay, what's in it for us? What is the ROI of it? So how much can I gain from it? Perfectly fine, and I wouldn't really try to confuse you about that. But it is indeed so that you can define a lot of other success criteria as well. If, for example, you'd say, oh, I'm living perfectly fine on public subsidies. Or, hey, no, you know, I only have a budget, and if I don't use it this year, they will just cut it off from me next year, so therefore I just need to spend it. I don't care about anything else. Then this makes as much of a reasonable framework as business outcomes would. And then, of course, what would your boss say about it? And, of course, what would your mother-in-law say about it? Well, okay, let me think, what does she have to do with the case?